who is Dr. Peter Adamson. Peter Adamson is a professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, as well as a professor of ancient and medieval philosophy at King's College London. Professor Adamson's primary areas of interest are late ancient philosophy and Arabic philosophy. He has written on several figures of the Greek tradition, such as Aristotle, Plotinus, and Porphyry, and of course, on numerous philosophers of the Arabic tradition, including Al-Kindi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, Yahya ibn Adi, Miskawayh, Avicenna, and Averroes. Aside from his numerous articles, monographs, and edited books, he is also the host of the podcast History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which is probably one of the most successful scholarly podcasts running continuously since 2010 until today. And by this, now I would like to invite Professor Adamson to present his talk.
Okay, so hi everybody, thanks for coming. Thanks for the kind introduction. So I will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation, so presumably you can see that, yes? And I just need to
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about a comparison that I've been thinking about for a few years, which is between something that's kind of familiar to a lot of historians of philosophy and something that's not so familiar. So since I only have 20 minutes, I'm kind of going to assume that the familiar thing is familiar to you. And if it's not, then you're going to have to maybe take my word for how similar the two things are. So the two things I want to compare here are philosophy in the Islamic world, especially philosophy in the Islamic world after Avicenna, in the Islamic East in the 12th and 13th century. So that means we're not going to be talking about, for example, Ibn Rushd or Averroes, because he lived all the way out in Muslim Spain, not in the Islamic East. So we're going to be comparing that to what happened roughly 100, 200 years later in Latin scholasticism. So think Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, Duns Scotus, that crowd, okay? So the thought here is going to be that there's two sort of philosophical movements which do not influence each other, because the earlier stuff that we'll be talking about from the Islamic East was not translated into Latin, but it's very similar, I'm going to claim, to Latin scholasticism. And I call this Avicennan scholasticism because it responds to Avicenna in the way that Latin scholasticism responds to Aristotle. Okay, so we're talking about a culture in which many commentaries are being written on a kind of primary figure who stands for philosophy. So if you say the philosophers say that in Arabic in this period, what you mean is Avicenna and his followers, just like you can call Aristotle the philosopher, right? And even works that are not commentaries on Avicenna are somehow responding to Avicenna. So everybody is responding to him one way or another. There are critics from a theological point of view, just as there are theologians who criticize Aristotle in Latin Christendom, and there are proponents who are exegetes of Avicenna. I should say before I start that this is what I'm going to be saying here is a very summary version of some of what we've discovered on this DFG-sponsored project called The Heirs of Avicenna, Philosophy in the Islamic East, 12th to 13th Century, and I've listed the people who have been working with me together on that. Okay, so I want to talk just about two issues here. I actually have many, many more parallels that I could give you, and there would be a longer version of this talk that involves going into more parallels, but since I don't have time for that, I'm just going to point out two similarities, or two areas of similarity. First, I'm going to talk about the way that philosophy was actually written in this period, and how much it is like scholastic Latin philosophy. And in a way, all I'm going to do is just show you an example and invite you to say, oh yeah, that sounds like scholastic Latin philosophy, because it's just sort of obvious that it does. If you've ever read any Latin scholastic philosophy, you'll think, oh, that doesn't look like philosophy from late medieval Central Asia. That looks like philosophy from 13th century Paris, right? But then I also want to talk to you about one specific philosophical issue, which is existence. But as I say, there would be many, many more examples I could give. So here are just a few that came to mind for me. So we've got issues in logic, like attempts to define, well, the question of definitions itself, the attempt to define syllogisms, what are propositions, attempts to resolve paradoxes like the liar paradox, are a major theme in both cultures, problem of universals, divine command theories of ethics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And it's obviously not going to be the case that the same positions are taken in both cultures, but the kind of logical space of possible solutions to these problems, and the fact that both Aristotle and then Avicenna are in the background in both cultures means that you do actually see a lot of the same ideas coming up. So for example, just to take one random example from this list, there's a philosopher named Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi who has an impetus theory, which is a lot like John Burden's, even though Burden doesn't read Abu Barakat. Okay, so let's go on to my first point, which is, what are we talking about in terms of like text? What's it like to read this stuff? Well, the first thing to say is that there's just an immense amount of it, just like there is in Latin scholasticism. So anyone who tells you that they've read all of the philosophical works written in the 12th and 13th century is either a native speaker who's probably pretty old and has been doing this since they were young, or more likely is lying or isn't aware of how much there is. So, I mean, there are individual works that fill a shelf. And there are dozens of philosophers, and many of them wrote numerous works that can fill a shelf, or at least their works total would fill a shelf. So, I mean, we have a collection of books that we've been getting together, which is only a fraction of what we've been working on for the project. And between our online or our digital resources of scanned editions of and manuscripts and our bookshelves, we're talking about many, many, many gigabytes of images of text plus numerous shelves of books, right? So there's a huge amount of material. Now, because there are dozens of philosophers and theologians, and it's not always clear whether we should call them philosophers or theologians because they're often kind of both. There's many, many figures in the period, but I would say the main figures, if you start from the death of Ghazali, would be these four people: Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi, who I mentioned before, Suhrawardi, Fakhreddin Arazi, and Nasiruddin Tusi. He also has a kind of circle of philosophers gathered around him. For example, a very influential logician and Katibi, a commentator on Suhrawardi named Ibn Kamuna. And these, I think the reason why these four are really interesting and important is that they set out to do something more or less like what Avicenna had set out to do. So just as Avicenna set out to replace Aristotle as the main figure in philosophy, and he succeeded because none of these people are engaging directly with Aristotle, they're all engaging with Avicenna. So these people, especially Baghdadi, Suhrawardi, and Razi, they are extremely innovative, independent-minded philosophers who are trying to put forward their own systems. And they even sometimes come up with names for their own systems, like Suhrawardi calls his philosophy the philosophy of illumination. Tusi is a bit different because he's much more inclined to follow Avicenna. And he writes a commentary on Avicenna that's quite favorable, responding to a critical commentary by Razi. So I'm just mentioning these guys so that you have some names to associate with the phenomenon I'm going to be talking about. But as I say, it's a much larger phenomenon than just them. Now, a lot of the research on this until the last few years was really kind of preliminary in the sense that it was talking about like, how are their works structured? How do they write? What is their philosophical method and their attitude towards philosophy? One thing that you sometimes see is that they write dialectically. So this may be a habit that's sort of borrowed from Kalam, in other words, Islamic rational theology, where you say, well, someone might say this, but if they say that, we'll say this, and it goes back and forth. Already you can see there might be a kind of echo of something that happens in scholastic philosophy, because that's a lot like a disputed question. And in fact, many of these works are set up that way. So here's an issue, here's a range of positions on the issue, and here are arguments on both sides. Sometimes with the rather frustrating conclusion that all the arguments are set out on both sides, and then it says, but God knows best. So you don't even know what the author's solution is. So that would be another sense in which these works might be dialectical, like merely dialectical. They don't actually even reach a conclusion. That's especially true, for example, of some works by Razi. So let me just give you an example of what it's like to read this stuff to show you how much it is like reading Latin scholastic philosophy. And this is going to be incomprehensible, by the way, just to warn you. I mean, I could explain what's going on here, but it would take much too long. So the point is just to get the feel of what the text is like. So this is from an author named Abhari, so it's not one of the four main guys I mentioned before. When we say that something is universal, we may mean three different things: liquidity as such, the consideration of its being universal, or their composition. Let it not be said, we do not concede that everything extramentally existence is individuated. For animal as such exists extramentally, but is not individuated. For we say, when we claim that everything extramentally existent is individuated, we mean that everything extramentally existent may truly be said to have a concrete identity in extramental reality. And one can truly say of animal as such that it has a concrete identity in extramental reality. So it is true to say of it that it is individuated as an accidental predication. And this goes on for another couple of pages, but I won't bother you with all of it. But I'm giving it to you, not, I mean, as I say, just so you get a feel of it, but notice also several features of this. So we have extreme amount of technical terminology, including terms that are used to sort of mark stages in the argument, like if you say this, or let no one say this because we will say this, right? And they also have words for what in Latin would be called a problem, and in fact, what in Greek was already called a problem, a problema. They usually call that a question, a masala. And then they have different solutions, each of which is called a waj. So we have a problem and then approaches for dealing with the problem. And then the approach may be approved or refuted. We have terminology used to structure arguments, like giving a reductio argument and saying, and that conclusion is absurd, therefore the original premise is false. As we saw, they say, let it not be said because we will say this. They even give arguments and then say, wa huwa al-matlub, which means, and this is the desired result. So QED, quod erat demonstrandum, right? And then there's massive amounts of technical terminology. So going back to this, we have, okay, universal, quiddity, individuated, extramental, and concrete existence. We even have the example of animal as a standard candidate universal. It's all very much like Latin. And in fact, if I hadn't told you the author and hadn't put Arabic in brackets and had given you this and asked you to guess where it was from, you would surely have guessed that it was from Latin scholastic philosophy. You might think, well, probably Peter has selected this because it looks so much like that, but that's not true. I picked this by basically just scrolling through one of our files where we've been translating the material at random and just picking one, okay? That's what it's all like, pretty much. Okay, so that's just the first point. It's a lot like Latin scholasticism in terms of the way that it's structured and written. So as I say, logical terminology, is a very self-conscious attitude towards the way one is arguing, structure of text in terms of disputed questions or something like a disputed question, and packed full of technical terminology, which goes back to either Aristotle or Avicenna, or sometimes to other authors in Kalam. Now I want to not leave you disappointed by not talking about any actual philosophical topics. So I want to just throw like one example in here of how a philosophical problem was actually discussed. And I've chosen it because it's such a good example of a resonance between Latin scholasticism and this thing I'm calling Avicennan scholasticism. So this is about a very central issue, which is existence, or you might say being. So this is what in Latin would usually be called esse. And in Arabic, it's usually wujud, which means existence. And this is a word that Avicenna makes really central in metaphysics. And Avicenna has a lot to say about existence. So for example, in the passage I was just quoting, we have this contrast between extramental or concrete existence and mental existence, which comes up a lot in our tradition. But I'm going to be talking about something else, which is the difference between analogical and univocal existence. So the basic problem here is we might think that it's wrong to use words about God in the same way that we apply them to things in the created world, right? And this is familiar with examples like, let's say, powerful or good or generous, right? So this would be a kind of general problem of divine attributes. Can you say that God is powerful and use that word in the same way that we apply it, for example, to the President of the United States? And usually they'll reject that proposal because they don't want to make God comparable to created things. Here we have a somewhat more abstract question, which is, well, if I say that God is existent or has existence or is an existent, am I using those words in the same way as I do when I refer to existent created things? And there's three possible positions, of which two will be of interest to us. The first is that these uses of the word existent are outright equivocal, so they don't have any shared meaning at all. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the idea that they are univocal. So when I say that God is existent, I mean the same thing by the word existent that I mean when I say your computer is existent, that you're staring at it right now, or your phone, or whatever you're staring at, okay? And in between, we've got the notion of analogical existence, which is harder to understand, but it's something along the lines of saying, well, God has existence, I have existence, and those two kinds of existence aren't exactly the same, but they have something in common. Like, for example, maybe God is a paradigmatic, perfect example of existence, whereas I have defective existence. What Avicenna would say is that God has necessary existence, and I have merely contingent existence. So in Latin philosophy, there's this very famous dispute about this, where Aquinas and Henry of Ghent are leading proponents of the analogical reading of existence. Scotus is the most famous for having taken a univocal stance on the meaning of existence. And it's already been pointed out in some literature on Avicenna that he uses this word tashkik, which sounds like it means something like analogy. So in fact, it was even used to describe analogical predication in Aristotle. So people are already aware that in Avicenna, there's this sort of anticipation of analogical theories of existence, and people have talked about the parallel between that and Aquinas, and also between these figures and a much later figure from the Safavid era, so later philosophy in Persia, in Mullah Sadra. But what I want to tell you about is something that happens earlier in the 12th and 13th centuries, where we have a dispute between univocal and equivocal readings of existence but really kind of anticipate what happened later in the 13th century and in the early 14th century in Europe, in Latin. So most of our authors in our period take an analogical reading, or sometimes we translate this as modulated. So for example, Suhrawardi, who is one of the big figures I mentioned at the beginning, says, existence applies in a modulated way to the necessary more appropriately and primarily, then to substance, and then to accidents, which are stable in essence. Among such accidents, the non-relative is more perfect. So here you can say he's not only distinguishing between divine existence and created existence, he's saying, well, the best kind of existence is God's existence. Then we have created substances like me, a human. Then stable essences like my baldness or my maleness, perhaps. And then relative accidents like my being the father of my children. Okay, so we have actually 4 degrees of existence. But we do have at least one prominent thinker who is going to defend the same position that Scotus defends, or will defend later, namely that existence is univocal. There's a kind of complicated relationship between what he's saying here and the idea that essence and existence are distinct. So basically his idea is, well, either you have an essence that implies your existence, in which case you're God, because you're necessary existent, or you have an essence that doesn't imply your existence, in which case you're a contingent entity. So you might exist, you might not exist. But either way, what's going to come to your essence, either because it's intrinsically necessary or because it's been given to the essence by a cause, the same thing will come to the essence, namely just existence. Existence is always the same. But I don't want to suggest that making a real essence-existence distinction forces you to have a univocal theory of existence. That's not true, because Aquinas and Giles of Rome both adhere to an analogical theory of existence, but accept the essence-existence distinction. Okay, so what's really striking is that when Fakhreddin Razi is arguing for a univocal theory of existence, he gives arguments that are just like the arguments we find in Scotus. So he says, well, we start with the notion of existence, and then we divide it between necessary and contingent, eternal and temporal, uncreated and created. He even makes a really specific argument, which we find in Scotus, which I think is a brilliant argument. It's really interesting that they both came up with this, which is that you could know something or believe that something exists without knowing whether it was necessary or contingent, right? So you must have a concept of existence that spans these two modal properties. And so that means that existence is a kind of umbrella term that includes both necessary existence and contingent existence. And then other people rebut these arguments that Razi gave by arguing that it's not that necessity and contingency apply to existence, which is this umbrella term, but rather we have necessary essences and contingent essences, and they get an appropriate kind of existence, right? So I think I'm running out of time, right? So I won't go into all these arguments, but the point is that they say that different levels of being, as we saw with Sohrawardi, will get different kind of flavors of existence, and so they're going to defend an analogy theory, just like Aquinas and Henry of Ghent did. So this is a very striking case where we see very similar arguments. I mean, almost to the point where you could not know which culture a certain translated passage came from, right? If I just gave it to you in English, you'd have to see the original to know whether it was in Arabic or Latin. I mean, it's almost that similar. And the explanation is obvious in this case. It's because they're both responding ultimately to Aristotle, yes, and his theory of essentialism, but in the first instance to Avicenna. So it's because Aquinas and the rest of the scholastics and these philosophers writing in Persian and Arabic were reading Avicenna and sort of thinking about Aristotelian metaphysics through Avicenna, that they came to the same problems and solutions. And I think this really sort of supports a claim that I would want to make anyway, which is that Avicenna is probably the most important medieval philosopher, because he's this key figure who explains the development of both Latin scholasticism and Avicennan scholasticism. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Adamson, for your definitely brilliant presentation. And I can only regret that we are very much limited by the time. So, and now, since we have still at least 5 minutes, I invite everyone to pose question or comment on Professor's presentation. So please, you may either raise your digital hand or post your question on the chat.
Can I say hello to Richard Sorabji? Hi, Richard. Good to see you. Oh, I think you're muted, Richard.
Professor Sorabji, would you? Yeah. Now we should hear you.
Good. I'm very sorry I missed most of Peter. I was behind with my own preparations.
That's a habit you should have gotten out of decades ago, Richard.
I should have learnt a bit earlier, shouldn't I? Yes.
I always think it's funny when I go to conferences and people tell me that they're spending the evening in their hotel room getting ready for their talk. Next day. Bad planning.
Okay, so yet seemingly no remarks. Oh, I see a question from or comment from Professor Daniel King.
Hi, Peter. I just wondered whether is there any information about whether Scotus and these others had read any post-Avicennan philosophy Arabic philosophy? Was Razi ever read by any of them or anything like that?
In the Latin Scholastics.
Yeah, Scotus, especially noticing the similarity of Scotus'
I mean, basically, no. So
arguments for those of Razi.
So Razi, as far as I know, was I mean, the last figure from the East who's significantly translated would be Ghazali at the beginning of the 12th century. So he dies in 1111, and after that, the sources from the East don't really make it into Latin. In fact, as long as you're asking me this gives me an opportunity to say something I always like to say, which is that there's been people have for many decades had this idea that philosophy in the Islamic world kind of ends around 1200. So Averroes died in 1198, right? And people often think of him as the last significant philosopher in the Islamic world. And the reason for that is that the Arabic Latin translation movement happened in the late 12th century. So, and of course it mostly focused, I mean, from people in that period, it naturally enough focused on people who were living in the West, like near where the translators were. So the reason why you might never have heard of these guys I was just talking about, if you haven't, is that they weren't translated into Latin because they lived too late or they lived too far east. There's some stories about like maybe scholars from the Islamic East being known in places like in the Mediterranean, but if we're talking about actual translations that would have been available to the Scholastics, no. By the way, I should mention that there's also at least one author. So these works are mostly in Arabic, sometimes in Persian, but there is one author who writes in Syriac, who's Bar Hebraeus. And Bar Hebraeus is very much engaged with this kind of material. So he's writing the same kinds of works, but he's Christian and he's writing in Syriac. He's a late example of late Syriac philosophy. So that's interesting.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question, if I may, about some of the vocabulary that you were putting in some of those slides? This is a question out of ignorance, really, but is a lot of this Avicennan terminology, or did Avicenna mostly adopt this from Farabi and others before him?
Well, for these guys, it's certainly Avicennan, so that's where they're getting it. So you do have, for example, the word wujud is also in Farabi, existence.
Yeah, that's not fun.
Or the word mahia for quiddity is also in Farabi. Some of the technical terminology around sort of argumentation steps is also pre-Avicennan. So I think actually it's not so much that the vocabulary is distinctively Avicennan as such for the most part. It's more that it's the like philosophical preoccupations of Avicenna that they pick up. But there are exceptions. So for example, that idea I mentioned, the difference between mental and concrete existence, that's Avicennan language. So wujud fi dhin is mental existence, or dhithni, and wujud khariji is external existence. Right. So there are examples of both, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I see that there is still another question, but since we are very much running out of time, maybe if possible, we can, if Professor Adamson is available tomorrow, we would like to perhaps invite to the session tomorrow, which will be on comparative metaphysics, and where we will have an opportunity to discuss it more. So, so perhaps now I will hand out a microphone to my colleague, Dr. Moise.